Thank you, Susan, and thanks to the speakers, the discussants, and those who provided the comments in the previous section. So after the sort of discussions we've had in the past two sessions, it's now over to think about the the big policy questions, the big policy issues that might be emerging, things that we should be sort of grappling with and involved in. So I'm not going to take any more time. I'm just going to turn the floor over to Fernando. Fernando, you have 15 minutes and the clock starts now. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for the invite. I think the second time I'm invited to this discussion. I'm very pleased for that. So let me maybe take you in a different direction because, of course, I'm in my everyday life, I'm not an academic. I'm more on the policy side and maybe on the multilateral. Some of you were referring to this. And so, but I had the opportunity to work on some of these topics even 10 years ago. And so what I wanted to do is, I mean, of course, we have offered this, we were given this kind of 3 guiding questions as a reference, some of the methods and indicators, of course, in my sort of more of my activities, I think I can maybe probably talk about a bit of this. And I will do that from the base of my experience working in the topic, and then sort of take you to something like, I think it's also a personal journey with this topic, right? So, and this is really taken 10 years ago, more or less, when I was at the IDRC. And some of Professor Joseph already referred to the program we had there at the IDRC. So what I would say is, in looking at what is the future, of how to make the community's work relevant for policy. Let me just use it, the word relevant in the sense of connecting to some of the debates, not in terms of the sort of utilitarian view of it, right? So, I mean, I remember when we started the work at the IDRC around 2010, actually 2011. What we found, it was a very deep discussion around, models around, is innovation happening in informal settings? Is innovation happening in rural communities? And if it happens, how do we actually characterize that? So, and when we have sort of mapped some, very, active networks, like, the Honeybee is one of the most popular or best known, but there were some others, and even in some of those networks, including work from this community. So that created a space. There was sort of kind of a practitioner, development community interested, and some of the communities were also trying to be visible in their work. So the kind of the practical environment was there. We also noticed in the academic community, there were some people who were telling us, yes, if you're an economist and you think of innovation, many times innovation is taken as a good in itself. But are there downsides, right? So we know there are different ways of dealing with innovation. If you start from different positions. I mean, we talk about catching up, we talk about inequalities, but also the capabilities that you need to do innovation are not necessarily the same. Either you are in a company, or a community. So you have different races or different ways of looking at these things. So competitiveness is one driver, but tends to be the social aspects tend to be forgotten. Some others say we need to be more directional. We have to identify and recognize diversity of knowledge and how this is distributed in terms of power and access to the knowledge that is useful for innovation. And of course, as some of you have already referred, so recognizing the different sorts of knowledge have different ways to contribute, but that doesn't mean they are not valid. It's just simply experience versus background in academic terms creates a different setting, but you can still contribute to the sort of creating some solutions. I mean, the emphasis here was to create some attention into the social and in some of the environmental aspects, and not necessarily focusing on the economic competitiveness. Innovation is a bit more than that, right? And we had some debates, and then that created the space for a program where some of you, Professor Judith mentioned, I think in the earlier some of the thematic report, one of the first thematic reports from the community from Globelix, it's identified that some of the issues around inclusive development was also connected to some interest from the donor community, some of the multilateral agencies, like particularly the UN system, around these issues. And the IDRC in Canada created this program. It was a very short-lived one. But it was, trying to engage with some of those issues. And that's where, I was coming from. So I found, in a way, one of the first conclusions we have here is that the setting was propitious for these things. So there was policy interests from the donor community and some of the multilateral agencies. The academic field was, debating intensively on this. And of course, there was a basics that the communities were working on this. But also within the community of Globelics. I mean, I remember this group, no? The Group of Research and Innovation for Inclusive Development. And it's not a coincidence that you see a lot of the papers presented at the Globelics conference in Buenos Aires addressing the topic, simply because they either see kind of influence a little bit of the negotiation there. We were trying to launch a new program, and you can see some of the photos. Some of you might recognize yourself there. So for us, the Globelics community was a very natural partner to start working with. But we also understood that some of the topics and the grid itself, it was a group that recognized that it was not necessarily sometimes well perceived within the community. So there were some tensions, there were some issues that the community needed to really grapple, as Mita mentioned, issues of development, and not necessarily from the pure economic and technological perspective of understanding innovation. So we brought some of the other networks and just created, as Judith Sud mentioned, opportunities to learn from others, opportunities to engage with other kinds of fields and perspectives, including some of those perspectives considered more on the STS, the science, technology, and society dimensions that sometimes is not difficult. So, what do we do with this? And what I'm trying to get from this, the program, and this is also Professor Joseph mentioned that we had a special issue on one of the Innovation and Development Journal. So we propose, and I think listening to some of the colleagues in earlier interventions, I think the agenda that we introduced for the community in terms of focusing on innovation and informality is pretty much valid still. There's issues around universities, issues around gender, what are the sort of entities that connect informal settings with the sort of the more formal sources of knowledge, and what are the roles and what are the sort of the policy implications for that. And of course, focusing when we talk about informality, we tend to understand what kind of economic activities or ways of organizing economic activities to address some of the needs. So the idea of innovation, not as a technologically driven, but also as problem solving. I think that's a very important dimension that we sort of were introducing in this case. And of course, some of the contributions, as I mentioned, the program at the DRC was very shortly because of the financial crisis at the time. The program was prematurely ended. But we managed to get some of the frameworks. I mean, Professor Schutz and Susan were contributing and working with us, and have frameworks how to address these topics. Maybe Professor Fred Gault can tell us a bit more, even how to capture, how to measure, how to develop indicators based on these notions. So, the idea here is that many of these things resonate to the current debates. We still are now working from UNIDO, which we focus more on industrial development. And sometimes, again, the tensions here is that we understand that many of the countries that we work with are not at the same level. They cannot really be compared or said that they can develop or grow in the same way, because simply we need to recognize that innovation needs to be appropriate for the country and the context. And it's not enough to just grow. You need to identify the mechanisms around them. But also, there's a lot of emphasis on the policymakers. The policymakers need to understand the trade-off between the economic, social, and environmental dimensions that many of you have been referring to. So that leads me, and maybe this is really where I would like to end and take a bit more time to reflect with you, because I think the question was, how do we make some of this relevant for the community? And just because I'm sitting here and I don't see my screen. One of the first things, and I'm going to, if you allow me, I'm going to talk in two levels. One is of course, the academic work. The other one is issues of engagement and how do you actually go beyond the research, which is, I think, is important for the policy perspective. So one of them, as I mentioned earlier, we need to be visible. As a community, we need to be visible and to be recognized as a relevant partner. So we had the grids. Of course, I've been, away from some of the academic work more intensively. But is there a way to identify a group? This group can be solidify itself and become a reference for some of the multilaterals. For example, we sometimes create, there are many reports, many documents, and we always, looking for partners. And so, is the Globelics community pushing some of these agendas? Can we identify them? Sort of saying, the grid is a legacy, or is just, or this is kind of informal setting. So what is the way we can organize as a community to to become more visible in terms of the research and how to communicate the research, right? So, and I've seen some of the comments in the chat. Somebody referring, Manuel, I think, referring to the global agenda, and this again, learning from the past, when I say, there was a interest in the donor community and the policy community. I mean, where are those debates now? I mean, of course, what they working for the UN, one of those that refer me immediately is the Global Development Agenda for 2030. This year we are halfway, and we see because of the pandemic, because of conflict, and because of some of the commercial wars between the US and China and other countries, we see emerging, the progress we have made in the past 7-8 years. It's actually been regressing. And so what are the implications in terms of how do we move faster? How do we, in some of the debates in New York, is how do we rescue the SDGs? Are they still valid? Can we start looking for the next time? What is the future for the agenda? Still, we have some years, but it's evident that in 7 years we will not be able to catch up and to achieve some of the goals. So what is the community can contribute to that? And this also, we have been discussing. I was also invited to discuss on the digitalization part. And we see, there's a lot of innovation taking place, not only in digital, but on some materials and around of issues of environment. So, and those, as we have seen, they also have their own implications in terms of inequalities, not only in terms of income, but as we have been discussing earlier today, in terms of how countries, how communities, how companies are positioned to actually catch up or to address some of the trends. Digital divides are growing. The role of special communities, do we have skills? What happens with those who have not the chance to adapt to the new environment? So there's issues of inequality which go beyond income inequality and also needs to be addressed. And of course, let me now say, maybe you start from the last one. In terms of the research agenda, I think we have sometimes when we write some of the reports, industrial development report, we tend to have some clarity on sort of environmental dimensions and even the gender dimensions. But beyond that, so how do we actually capture inequality or some of those social aspects? So how do we? So is it about youth? Is it about SMEs? Is it about indigenous communities? If you think of the report from the UNTAD, sort of the technologies, it's a very broad. When we get to the point of entities like UNIDO, where we focus on industrial development, it's not that easy to sort of what is the relevant dimension that we need to address. And of course, as Anne was asking the questions about gender, right? We see this idea that it's not about including women and reproducing the same roles, traditional roles that we are not comfortable with, but also this idea of transformative policies of how to create the space for women to be more preeminent. So not about I said replicating the roles we know, but creating a different space for them. And so all these things. I mean, I remember when we're developing the program for inclusive development, one of the things that we discussing is, can we talk about development without inclusion? Or I mean, do we need to have inclusive development? Is it not the same thing? I think we still have some of those questions there. And just to make sure, I mean, maybe one of the things that we started doing, and I think one of the contributions to the program is we had managed to integrate some of these efforts and to create some kind of reference. Maybe 10 years along the lines, is there a way to contribute something similar, right? But what I think is also very important in terms of the policy dimension or policy oriented that you as a community have a sort of an opportunity is, can we go beyond the research and the analysis and the frameworks, and to turn some of these knowledge into sort of practical tools? And that's perhaps also my sort of my own challenge, right? So that's my color. Where I go, I'm not supposed to deliver just a talk. When I had supposed to deliver tools, guidelines, and that's not me. I mean, it's many of these what you talk about, the development system. It's really that. So, and we have been working with some for about 3-4 years now, developing some trainings on how to design or how to use the SDGs as a reference for the design of STI policies. And you see the problem with many of the policymakers. Either they are not engage with the topics. They don't. The discourse of the SDGs is quite hard. The use of indicators, and then I go the reference maybe later for for Fred to comment on how do we actually measure the progress in those indicators. Are those indicators the ones that we need? Are those valid? Are there methodologies? Are they really reflective of the situation? We had Erika and I were like a couple of weeks ago in a meeting. This year we will have a review of progress around SDG 9, and we were talking about inclusive innovation. I mean, it actually took me back to sort of the 10 years ago. We're discussing scalability, pertinence. Is it just, Anil Gupta and the honeybee network? What else? What is happening? Are the cases, are the examples? How policy works? It's really, it seems that 10 years along, like we're still asking some of those similar questions. And that's reflected in how then policymakers can act on this and how can really incorporate in their everyday life some of those lessons, right? Come they have to be decisions. So what I would say, there are, again, 2 or 3 things here. One is, of course, taking stock of the products we have developed so far. How do we engage within the community, within ourselves? How do we organize ourselves as a group that is interested in inclusive development vis-a-vis other partners? But also the research has to also have a component on how do I translate this into opportunities to set dialogues with the policymakers who are supposed to take decisions. And in many cases, the problem is that we don't know where policies need to be placed. We don't know what kind of skills, we don't know what kind of frameworks policymakers need to mobilize and how to engage when they, in terms of the dialogue and the language they use or they need to use when they address all of these topics. I will leave it there, and then if there is any question or any comment, I will be happy to address. Thank you.
Thank you, Fernando. You're absolutely on time. You're a dream speaker for somebody who's a facilitator of the session. So, with your comments, let me turn the floor over to Fred Gault for comments.
Thank you.
Over to you, Fred.
Very good. Fernando really covered ground on the history of the subject and where it could be going in the future, which makes my life a little easier in this respect. Part of this was a reference to case studies that were going on 10 years ago when IDRC engaged Fernando after my project came to a good end, I think, at one point. But those papers are still out there in the literature, and I believe you have access to my draft notes on what I'm trying to say today. So if you do have access, and I think everybody does, then you can have all of the references to those items we were talking about. It was an important time. Now, some of you know we're a statistical office a long time ago on other things since then. So I am obsessed by definitions. Sure. But one of the issues about innovation is the definition, the use of the definition in statistical measurement to support comparisons of innovation. We'd like to know how countries are getting on when we compare them and whatever they are doing with innovation. And this isn't a static dealing with innovation in the business sector. Notice I just qualified it as business sector. The definition of innovation went through 4 states. The first one was OECD on its own, 2, and then Eurostat joined in 1997, 2005, and 2008. They were used by the European Union in the Community Innovation Survey. And I dragged in the Community Innovation Survey in the European Union because it was adopted by other countries. And the example that I will put before you is the use of CIS in African countries engaged in excuse me, engaged in Science, Technology, and Innovation Indicators Initiative. This is something which has been going on since 2007. And the innovation is now in its third, going on fourth edition of the African Innovation Outlook. The African Innovation Outlook is actually worth looking at. There are 3 stages out there now approaching this problem a little differently each time, but it is making measurement in countries in Africa, which is telling us about a lot of things to do with innovation and with inclusive development, less on inclusive development because they're still trying to work out what it means. That's another issue. A characteristic of innovation in annual is that it is not normative. So when you are measuring these things, as you would do working through the OECD, you would expect to measure innovation. That innovation can kill you, or it can do positive things for you that you need to know about in order to do analysis and to guide policy. Measurement is important. First step, I must stress that point. So to measure innovation for inclusive development, there needs to be a measure of a survey population to identify the innovative and the non-innovative. And you can do this because statisticians know how to run surveys, we hope. So if they can do this, then end up with a population in the survey of the innovative and the non-innovative, then the innovative population can be probed independently or at the same time, reveal the innovation for development. We're still a little worried about what it is. And this requires a clear definition. Notice I'm stressing that point, clear definition of inclusive development. We've had comments made in the course of this discussion today about the need for definition. Make this point, consider the definition of innovation in the business sector, and I'm going to talk about defining innovation in the business sector. Notice I just restricted it considerably, talking about business. I will do something a little different in a moment. Business innovation, that's a cool thing. CD Eurostat 2018. A business innovation is a new or improved product or business process that differs significantly from previous products or business processes, and that has been introduced on the market, notice the pause, or brought into use by. Why am I pausing at introduced on the market? Because that is quite a serious restriction on innovation activities, and I'm going to come to deal with that in a moment, trying to get me back to what we have been talking about in the course of the day. So in the fourth, and what another point I'll make on is that introduced on the market is just that. It doesn't have to be purchased, sold, or have anything doing to it. It is just, it gets to market, that's all. Fourth edition of the Oslo Manual provides a general definition of innovation in all, notice the word all, economic sectors as follows. It's to you, listen, these. So an innovation is a new or improved product or process that differs significantly from the unit's previous products or processes, and that has been made available, wait for it, to potential users, or brought into use by the unit Now, the point I'm going to stress is that innovation for inclusive development now cover all the economic sectors and can be part of a system of activity. So if we actually go with the general definition of innovation, we are able to open that up to every economic sector we face. You can have the public sector contributing information on this subject and have households doing it. It is every economic sector. I've written about it in various places which you can read. So I lay before you innovation for inclusive development, which can cover the economic sectors and can still be part of a system for analysis. This is getting a little more complicated than what we are used to but so long as the OECD is in place and so long as the European Union is in place, this is how innovation is going to be measured. And then you can apply various restrictions on that. But yes, you have innovation. Also does different things in addition, which matter to us, we the people who have been talking about this way and dealing with this morning or this evening, wherever you are. I'm now going to look at people, kind of career trying to avoid people, but they do keep popping up. People rather than things or processes. So far, we've looked at the Also manual, definition of innovation, followed by restriction of studying sustainable development. And the restriction is inclusive development. So I'm going to leave you with a question. It is how do we, rather than things or processes, an example is social innovation. We haven't talked a lot this morning about social, but it is out there. The question is how you involve the behavior of people and measurement to tell us about inclusive development. And the definition of definition of social innovation, and there are many definitions. The Also manual is innovation, it's a good start, defined by their social objective. Innovation defined by their social objectives to improve the welfare of individuals. You start off with people needing to decide how they are going to do it, and they do it. Must be running out of time. People are looking. I will get to the end then. I'm going to end on mention. I'm not going to recite them for reasons you're about to see. We've got 17 goals. Great. Innovation appears in number 9 only. And each of the SDGs goal, but it has a sub goal. That's where we get the 169. And innovation appears in 6 of them, 6 out of 169. Is this going to be a basis for measurement and analysis? I leave with you, not just yet. There are 232 unique indicators that follow. Innovation does not appear. So if we are trying to address the problems that we are discussing in this group, we need better measurement, or we need different. Give us the information we require in order to address the subject matter. So I end with happiness of some. While much work has been done, there still is a great deal of work involving statistical measurement and analysis. It's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred. Thank you. Fernando, do you want to take a couple of minutes to quickly respond to the point that Fred made about social innovation or the different kinds of indicators that are required if SDGs are to be met? Would you want to, or would you like to hold them until the end? Just 2 minutes.
Yeah, well, thank you. 2 minutes. I mean, this issue of social innovation, I think, is also a major source of of policy complications, right? Because when you talk about social innovation, immediately the agencies responsible for science technology innovation say, it's not my role. It's the development agencies or is the rural community agencies. So don't ask me, funding. So I think one of the issues that we're still kind of pending is how to reconcile the concepts and the mere notion of these communities, not as a sort of like a community development, but really as something that stands out in terms of the knowledge and the validity for the professions. And just to pick things, I mean, it's not only just about the measurement of the actual output, but also the measure or understanding the processes. Some of the things that, Smita now referred to the IDR, the Industrial Development Report in 2020. And I had a chance to work with Chico, with this marker movement. And there's a lot of technology and learning, but is this a way to democratize innovation or sort of democratize access to manufacturing? We understand manufacturing as the source of innovation, but when you get to these social dimensions, how do we interpret those? I mean, where you cannot really capture some of these dimensions that we are used to in terms of products of new process because of the scale of it sometimes, right? So some of those things I think in terms of measurement. Of course, as Fred mentioned, we are still discussing, and just the way he described the Oslo manual is not so that we were able to address these dimensions like 10 years ago, right? This is something also that shows the ability to influence some of the thinking in terms of the mainstream ideas about how to capture innovation.
Thank you. The indicator gap and the institutional gap, if you will, that goes with it or reflects one another. Okay, on that note, let's move to Glenda. Glenda, you have 10 minutes starting now. The floor is yours.
Balaji, unfortunately, Glenda had to leave earlier because of a migraine that had come up. So I wonder if you could give me a few minutes to say a few words.
Absolutely, Susan, the floor is yours. Thank you for filling in.
Okay.
And unfortunate for Glenda. We miss her.
Yeah, well, yeah, I won't be able to fill in completely for Glenda because her group at the HSRC in South Africa has really been a leader in measurement and in really closely connecting to policymakers who have huge challenges of inequality in the country. So they pay attention. And Glenda has put a lot of resources into developing methods in this area, Glenda and her group, which is very creative, and their experience illustrates the difficulties of connecting between, among three different things. One is kind of what we know about innovation and what we know about margins and groups that have been put on the margins of societies. Methods and measurements, and then the policymakers. So I commend to you their work on actually trying to do surveys of the type that Fred was just talking about, but in the informal economy, completely outside the sphere of regulation, with companies that don't show up on anybody's official government company list. And part of what they have needed to do to be able to develop those surveys is focus on one community at a time, to really start with kind of case study basis for survey measurement. And I think there's an important kind of lesson. It's part of what we're probably going to have to do to develop these methods that are going to be appealing to policymakers. In listening to all of our discussion in this workshop, I've been really struck by a couple of things that I've seen that have emerged as the conversation has gotten larger around innovation for inclusive development over the years, and with the globalist community very much in the lead. There's a couple of things that are really hard to deal with when we treat this as one topic, which I think we should, but so here's some of the challenges. One is the very fragmentation of the topics themselves. Which marginalization are we talking about? Which group are we talking about inclusion for? And Fernando gave gave one of those lists, but we heard them through the presentations. We've heard poor communities, we've heard rural areas, we've heard youth, we've heard gender as a dimension. We've brought in ability and disability as a dimension. SMEs is, of course, that's very rich territory in countries where those are startups out of low-income communities. In the US, it's just like the lead technologists going off and forming their own firms. So, but with all of those groups are very different in terms of how we're going to analyze them, how we're going to learn about the way that they innovate in their contexts in order to have agency in the development process. And I think it may be time in terms of future research agendas to just face that square on, not put everybody into the same box and assume that they're all the same, maybe learn some things in a comparative dimension from the study of innovation in those different categories, and try to move forward from there. But we're probably not going to be able to do it kind of all at once under some inequality label, as much as my work has flown under that label for quite a while. And that also gets tied up with the fact that the work has over the last 20 years been very rooted in case studies or in very specific technological areas like the ones that Smita brought in. And there's been this struggle to produce something that's more, that's larger scale information. And that's where the survey work comes in. But that's a tension we're going to be with for a long time. And the case studies themselves, I think we have to treasure them. Judith and I actually had some recommendations on kind of case study characteristics in this area in that background paper we did for the IDRC program. But both embracing what we learned from case studies and moving toward larger scale statements is certainly one of the challenges that we have. But that then relates to what the actual policy options are, because if you look back at our literature, and Fernando had some nice pictures of some of these at the beginning of his comments, the bottom-up programs are like case studies themselves. If you're a policymaker in some place like South Africa or Argentina or India, you've got a little portfolio of program options like the Honeybee Network, like grassroots innovation, like targeted innovation for a particular user group, like programs on that aim at disability. The ones in gender, really there's strong magnet, oh, let's get more women out there in science and engineering careers, and that's going to solve all the problems of like the somehow female smallholder farmers in Africa. But they're very fragmented programs and tend to be fairly small scale. And so the story that that Mariano told about the social technology program in Brazil, which is one of the great kind of tragedies in relation to this whole area, because it bloomed, it was creative, it was funded, and then it died, it was shut down. So I'm coming up with something that's scalable. Somebody's slide had scalability on it. There's coming up with something that's scalable has been really, really hard. And it may be that there's an intersection between that difficulty in the policy area and this fragmentation of topics. And it may be that as we disentangle the topics or treat them comparatively, individually and comparatively, that maybe some of those larger scale policy options will come about too. I actually made the the argument in my recent article in Innovation and Development that that the industrial policies that aim at producing middle income jobs actually reshape economies in really fundamental ways that the set of policy options that are usually put forward in this area don't quite capture. So those are a few thoughts. What I really love about our conversation through the day is that we started with both innovation studies in its full glory and Globalix as a leader in thinking about inclusiveness in that context, and policy right up front. Joe's beautiful pictures of the complex decision-making systems that are at the nexus of innovation and inclusive development. And so I think this is a great way to actually close off the workshop series, because there's so much going on in that space. There's so much that affects so many of the things that we do in innovation studies. So thank you, Balaji, for giving me a few spontaneous minutes there.
No, of course. I mean, I appreciate you filling in for Glenda, and sorry she had to leave because she was ill. But Fernando, do you have anything to say specifically to what Susan said as comments? And then we'll see if there are no comments, or if there are any comments, we'll take them and then hand the floor over to Erica to bring the curtains on the 5-session series.
Thank you, Balaji. I mean, thank you. And I think, yes, one of the dimensions that Glenda is also very active is in connecting the university as a relevant entity that, when we're talking about these intermediate agencies, about how they link the communities and the government and some of the entities, and the difficulty that it is in terms of the third mission for the university, which is, what I would say it's a challenge for the community, how to go beyond some of those, individual groups to create some critical masses. I mean, where I see a lot of this work being taken up more closely in Asia, particularly through some of the regional commission, the UN regional commission there, developing programs and try to work with governments. What you see is also diversity of, and maybe that's also an understanding for this community, how some of this work has been taken up. While we tend to think of policy as a sort of a very abstract category, where you see there's a lot of emphasis on entrepreneurial activities, because there is this impression that innovation is only, is one way to create economic opportunities. But I think what this community has been looking at is it's a bit more, but sort of how to actually engage with the policymakers to understand that it's not just entrepreneurial activity. It's not about just creating firms or just to formalize from the traditional view of the informal into formal activity. So I think that's an agenda, and Judith Schutz referred this morning about the work that the LALIX community has been doing around, the declarations and that. But maybe, it's also different regions have different ways of looking at. So maybe we need more than just one declaration. We need something that is more jointly developed by the whole community, and sort of try to recognize the diversity of views and how these topics have been taken in different regions by different actors, and see what is it that, more than the declaration, that also becomes perhaps an agenda for the community in terms of advocacy and some of the work that is beyond what I said, beyond the research, but more the transformative power of the research of the community requires also a bit more action and engagement with policymakers, but targeting a bit more that the sort of dialogue. Right? And I think that's again, what I was connecting to the global dialogue, the global debates could be an option. Thanks.
Thank you, Fernando. Michiko, you had a couple of comments in the chat section. Would you like to convert either of them into a question? I'm not sure they're questions, as they're just observation and comments.
Yeah. Thank you, Balaji, for taking this up. I think I made it, I don't know which comment that you were talking about, but perhaps something to do with the methodology about, I was wondering about how the new technology can come in with regards to the improving the methodology in trying to include the voices of the people Because I think that currently, of course, there are some technological divide due to the digital and all that. However, I think there are many innovative sort of upsurge of innovative method in collecting the people's voice or the data or analytics. And I was wondering, because these had not been mentioned, so I was wondering whether there has been any sort of cases that had been studied by others. That's just one point. But
Thank you,
thanks.
Michiko. Any comments from anybody else? Questions? The last round?
I don't know. I mean, I can maybe not necessarily on the methodology, Michiko, but I think it's also maybe during the course of the pandemic, I think these technologies are enabling exchange of knowledge and how people were, reacting to the pandemic. There's also, I think, that's a very interesting dimension of responsibility. And earlier on, somebody talked about peer review. And so how do we actually validate knowledge? I mean, and this, within easily you can dive into the risk of, the famous fake news and how to actually understand what's going on. I think that's a very critical question that you're raising, how the new technologies, particularly communication technologies and democratization of science can enable some of these debates. I mean, UNESCO has recently published some of the criteria for open science, right? Which somehow try to frame some of those debates, but I think it's an area that is emerging very rapidly, and innovation in that sense have these downsides in a positive way to connecting people, but also the possibility of connecting them in a way that perhaps is not necessarily what we need in terms of a situation that is an emergency and the information that is flowing is very difficult to validate. So how can the policymakers react to something that is emerging and there's no solid ground for them to make decisions, for example? I think that's a very important question.
Anything else from anybody? Otherwise, I think I'll just take the liberty of throwing in a comment myself to Fernando. Oh, KJ, I see your hand up. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I think I was a bit tensed when I was talking because my system was not working in the office, and I think I could not even say half of what I wanted to say. I think when we are today thinking about the future of the higher level of opportunities, so-called opportunities opened up by the Industry 4 and the emerging digital world, the nature and pattern, the kind of exclusion in the digital world is in fact perhaps more painful than the exclusion of the type that we have seen in the yesteryears. This is where what Fresoli said, we have to articulate in terms of participation and inclusion. And, I think here a long time back, Judith has taken up this issue, building on, in fact, I also made a little bit of work in the case of India's plantation agriculture, Amartya Sen's articulation of different forms of social exclusion and its manifestations in the real world. And here, I think in understanding, I think to the best of, we need to do much more work in the context of the digital world. And here again, I very much appreciate the point that Dinesh raised in terms of when we talk about third world countries' participation in the digital world or in the global innovation network in the digital world, the nature of exclusion that we confront, which apparently not very clear, apparently looks all fine. But then if you dig deep, one could find different forms of exclusion in the form of subordinated inclusion or so-called elusive inclusion. This is where I think we need to do more work. And that is where I appreciate the last session, Fresoli said, the context is different from what we confronted, say, 20 years ago. And I cannot agree with more in terms of Judith articulated the question of vaccine question in the so-called COVID period. And I think the perils of blindly following so-called comparative advantage and so-called trade liberalization and open world will give you what you want. It has not. COVID has clearly shown that. The shameful exclusion for the developing countries, particularly those from Africa, with respect to access to vaccines, thanks to the totally unacceptable policies by the North. And I think this is where, somebody again earlier raised in terms of the international negotiations, and India today, now the G20 India is the chair of G20, and I don't know to what extent these kind of issues actually get reflected in such high-level multilateral forums. And I think this is where that I think we, the GlobalX community, needs to kind of enlighten the policymakers in a big way. I think this particular session on policy implication, I think we have a big job to, big role to play. I don't know whether to what extent we are accomplishing that. And this is a major challenge for us in the years to come. I think I must also say that in our special issue, one of the first special issues was by Higgs, Prasoli, and others involved in that very much. I missed that when I was talking about that our innovation development contribution. Thank you very much.
Thank you, KJ. Fernando, any comments on that? Any response to KJ?
No, I think yes. Just very quickly, just as I mentioned, the issue of gender, right? So there is a lot of this debates on access for women to science or STEM education, a lot of these things. But then when you get, and some of the reasons, we had a forum on industrial policy like a couple of weeks ago, and then you see a lot of improvement in terms of women getting access to jobs in industrial activities. But as I said, the problem is that they get sort of the usual roles. So the lower skills and some kind of minor kind of activities. So the good job, the decision-making jobs are not necessarily for women. So we have to be very careful also when we look at indicators, and this is more of those, there is 50% of women now becoming the kind of the threshold, but I think they have to go deeper into the discussion. What exactly are these women being engaged with? So, and I think that's one of the, Joseph mentioned the special issue that we had in the innovation development. One of the papers is exactly what he was saying now about the frame, how to translate Amartya Sen, which I understand is not easy, into some kind of the practical categories to inform the policymakers and some of these dimensions, trade-offs between inclusion, yes, but what kind of inclusion? So there's also a way to qualify what we are talking about, and I think that's a huge challenge, because you get into discussion about values and principles and practices, which is not necessarily something that as economists by training are very attuned to do. Right? So that's what we need to expand the scope of the work that we do in the community, not just economic.
Thank you, Fernando. And talking about expanding the scope of our work, we've almost run out of time. So let me ask Erica to have the final word on GlobalX past, present, and future, expanding the scope of our work. So over to you, Erica.
Thank you. Thanks for giving me the floor. I have a few slides that I will put up. I hope they are visible. Are they, Balaji?
Very much.
Yes. Okay, great. So I've been given a very difficult task, and I will probably not accomplish it, as I have to start by saying that, because I've been given the task of sort of giving a reflection of from all the 5 workshops that we've held over the past few months. So I won't be able to do that, and also it's the wealth of the discussions has been so rich that that is almost I wouldn't even try to do it in 10 or so minutes. So I've put up a few reflections from my own. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of bringing all of this together into a concrete research agenda that we're hoping to share. at the conference in India. So these are just my personal initial reflections, incomplete and so on, but just to give a sense of, a bit of the flavor of what I think is been discussed. It's been a fantastic set of discussions. So yes, let me start by giving a little bit of an overview, and I think the first couple of slides I already shared in I think it was in the first workshop, but just to remind all of us that this is our 20-year anniversary. The first formal GlobalX meeting took place in November 2002, first conference in 2003, first academy in 2004. So it's sort of like more than anniversary year. This is an anniversary season, we can say. And we have an extended sort of period of celebration, reflection, of which these workshops are part of. It's important to remind ourselves that GlobalX was born from and remains a North-South, South-South dialogue. It started as a conversation among evolutionary economists and innovation system experts, but then over time it's integrated a wider social science background and expertise. And the discussions that we've had in these workshops have really been a testament of the diversity of disciplinary backgrounds that have been added to the GlobalX network over the years. Being such a North-South, South-Side dialogue platform has been a key driver of intellectual and scholarly development. And many of the presentations that we've heard as well show how much of the development that has taken up in the Global South has informed very much the evolution of the thinking within the network. The underlying principles that have been guiding this network have been that of shared commitment, and I think the commitment that we have all shown by participating in this series of workshops is a clear reflection of that. But we are committed to advance knowledge on how innovation and competence building links to development, and there's this shared preoccupation to promote inclusion and sustainable development, social and economic development. We are guided by broader principles of inclusion, tolerance, mutual respect and appreciation, gender equality and global representation, and we've tried to ensure that these principles are visible in the way in which these workshops have been organized, their participation, and I think in that respect we have adhered to our commitment and our principles. The original intention of this workshop series was to we can say is fourfold. On the one hand, is about celebrating these 20 years of consistent and expanding contributions from the network, engaging the GlobalX community in a series of thematically focused sessions to reflect on what we have accomplished and also the future agenda, to hear the voices of the founders, the established scholars and emerging scholars and students, so have this diversity of voices represented in the workshops, and engage in this collective exercise of defining GlobalX research agenda looking forward. And as I mentioned, this would be presented at the GlobalX conference in India, which this is a reminder. I know it's been shared in the chat a few times, but the call for papers closes, KJ, is this correct, on the 30th of April? And the website is there. Please make sure that you send your papers, and that we have a well attended 20th anniversary conference. These workshops have had about an average of about 60 to 70 participants in each event. Obviously, the attendance has varied over time, during the workshops themselves. So some people have dropped at different times of the workshop, but they have been extremely well attended. And in that respect, also we can say that this series of workshops have been a great success in terms of participation, but also the quality of the discussions. Just as a reminder for those that haven't joined the previous ones, we've had 5 themes that started in October 2022, covering knowledge-based development and local learning economies. The second one was on globalization and structural transformation. The third one on technological change and emerging technologies. the fourth one on environmental sustainable development, and this last one on innovation for inclusive development. The key questions that were asked were around three, guided the structure of the workshops, three sections, and I will not go too deep into this, but yes, we all have experienced this in this particular workshop, and the same structure has applied in previous workshops. First, to understand the state of the art, what are our contributions, how the discussion has evolved, what have been the key hotspots and shifts that have taken place. Section 2 has been about the research agenda, the future research agenda, particularly thinking about urgent issues that can be useful for the next generation of scholars to take forward, new areas of research that we need to look at, and how and the relevance of the network to take up strategic areas related to future challenges. And the third section is about policy methods and indicators, where we've been reflecting on methodological approaches, metrics and methods, and innovative methodologies under each of these themes. So let me here give you I have 2 or 3 slides speaking of some of the issues that have emerged across the themes. And again, I'm not trying to be comprehensive or at all. So I'm trying to just put in some thoughts from my side. I think there's something that has been coming up over and over again, is this appreciation for GlobalX and its unique features. It's been mentioned even today as well, but I think in every single workshop at some point has come up that it's a community with a soul, with friendship, with commitment, and that is visible in the way in which we conduct our discussions, and also in the events, and also in the shared preoccupation that we have about trying to get a better world. And we have to again thank all of us, including particularly the founders, for setting up that sort of spirit that we are carrying through in terms of the network and how it operates. The second recurrent point has been about the appreciation of the wealth of contributions emerging from this network across the various themes. And I will not try at all to try and summarize what those contributions have been for the past 20 years. But I think that it's clear that diversity is our great strength in terms of the methodologies used, the disciplinary backgrounds, which have expanded, the regional representation, ethnicity, gender, seniority, diversity is really core to the nature of this network. And it has also been very clear that this is a field in flux. There have been certain movements that have been constantly explained and described, particularly during that first section where we look at the state of the art. Some of these big movements of moving, this move from, for instance, moving from discussions around catching up to more inclusive development, green transformations, but there's other movements in terms of how the field has moved that we've been able to capture in these discussions. And again, it's been very clear that this north-south, south-south dialogue has been a clear driver of development. There is a lot of overlap across the 5 themes, and that has been very interesting to realize and notice those places where there has been overlap, particularly looking at issues related to emerging technologies and how that relates to issues around globalization and inclusion and green transformation and so on. Has been very interesting to see these overlaps, and we'll try and capture those. This current environment in which geopolitical shifts have changed the way in which countries and power is distributed across the world, have made the perspectives from the global south more relevant than ever before. And there's been a lot of presentation and discussion around the evidence of new strategies emerging from the global south and thinking about what we can learn from them, particularly China. But there's also a realization that there's a need for these southern perspectives to address global challenges. So when we think about solving some of the big challenges of our time, they cannot be done without southern perspectives. And there's a need also to identify opportunities for development in the current landscape, which is becoming more complex. And there's been a lot of discussion around that. The global forces of digitalization, globalization, localization, the pandemic, these widening inequalities have meant that some of these core contributions from globalics, such as interactive learning capabilities, innovation systems, have been evolving. So the nature, and for instance, there was a discussion in the workshop around emerging technologies about how the space of learning changes in view of these new and advanced digital technologies. What does that mean for learning processes, and how do we need to think and reconceptualize what interactive learning is and can be under that context? So the effect of these global forces in our concepts and theories has also been quite visible in the discussion. Some of the hotspots or pressure points that I want to mention, and again, many of them have been brought up, is the need to revisit this changing role of key actors in the innovation system. So the role of the state, the need for directionality, these multi-stakeholder platforms, identification of windows of opportunity, the co-creation of policy solutions, and so on, needs to rethink and revisit the role of the state. Universities as well, rethinking excellence, support the role of universities and knowledge generation to support different types of decision-making, changes in the knowledge generation process itself, as well as integration with other forms of knowledge, such as indigenous knowledge and so on, have been part of this idea of revisiting the changing role of actors in the system. There was a big discussion around the role of private sector and new dynamics that have to do with tech giants alongside small and informal players, the power dynamics that play out there, and how do we need to rethink the role of the private sector, as well as the role of civil society. Today has been, obviously, due to the issue of inclusion, a lot of underlying issues around participatory, open, collaborative approaches, social justice, even the definition of social innovation that Fred was mentioning, collective action, inclusion, ethics, all of that needs to rethink the role and how we look at civil society as an actor in the innovation system. Another set of hotspots come from this urgency from climate and social crises and the focus on the SDGs, which has given an increased attention to opportunities from developing countries in terms of leapfrogging in the sustainability workshop. There was a lot discussed about leapfrogging opportunities, twin transitions, green transitions, transformative change. And also paying more attention to these underlooked matters that are critical to shifting the needle. For instance, the role of finance, regulation, politics, the political economy aspects. Paying more attention to that. They haven't been absent in the literature, but they need to sort of regain further attention. There was a lot of definition as well of what development, a lot of discussion around what development is, and several workshops have brought that up. Another hotspot or pressure point is this pressure to capture and measure impacts and innovation modalities. Today, Fred reminded us on the importance of definitional challenges, methodological challenges, challenges in terms of resources and capabilities of countries to capture innovation for what, by whom, where, which brings up a whole set of issues. And as well as redefining the space or the location of innovation policy. So there has been, again, a recurrent mention to the need to integrate different policy areas, supporting innovation for development. How do you bring in social policy, environmental policy, other aspects of policy, economic, monetary policy, and so on, in connection with innovation. So the location of, where does innovation policy sit in connection to all of these other policy areas? So if they need to be integrated, puts a lot of pressures in our thinking on how do we deal with that at a conceptual, theoretical level as well as the need for new types of innovation policy making. The ways in which policy is made also needs to shift, therefore is putting pressures on our thinking. I think this is my my last, almost last slide. Some of the opportunities that have been mentioned, is about building on our first of all, building on our many achieved contributions and strengths, but also strengthen the collaboration across regions, thinking more strategically about how do we, and more systematically about how do we facilitate the mobility of people and ideas and how to do that more systematically, as well as being more deliberate in our conversations across different disciplines and framings. There's been a lot of mention about the work that has been advancing in the area of political economy, transitions, STS, future foresight studies, global value chains, and transdisciplinarity. So all of this, being more deliberate about how do we strategize our conversations with these different framings, sort of brings new opportunities for theory and methodological development. Being more visible in contemporary policy debates is another one of the opportunities that has been mentioned, and that requires bringing more regional mobilization, perhaps, but also thinking about how do we influence the discourse on specific themes, such as, how visible is GlobalX in the discussions around green transitions, digital transformations, health systems that has been very predominant during the pandemic, and so on. In an environment that is with a predominance of neoliberal perspectives. So what tools, what communications, what mechanisms do we need to bring to these debates? And all of this is also influenced by us being able to take advantage of digital technologies, which has implications in terms of the methods, the indicators, the collaborations, and the ways in which we influence policy, which can all be facilitated and advanced by digital technologies, the incorporation of digital technologies. So I would like to end with a big thank you. I couldn't make it bigger because otherwise I couldn't have the rest of the text in the slide. But if I could, I would have used the whole slide for a big thank you. First and foremost, to our funding members, because without them, we wouldn't have this wonderful network that we are all part of and enjoying and advancing and taking forward. All the participants that have joined the seminar from the GlobalX network, especially the students and emerging scholars who have joined and have spoken. We've been very glad to have your voice represented in the events. All of us have been making, prioritizing this event over other family commitments and other social obligations. So this is a real testament to the commitment and the dedication of the dedication of all participants of the network. All the speakers, the facilitators, the transcribers, particularly led by Andrew, and also Swati, Anurag, Kauri, Kopati, have helped with the transcription and the reporting in this event. So that is it's a key function of this, and without them we wouldn't be able to put all of this together. The organizing committee, Marina, Rasmus, Susan, Michiko, Andrew, myself, we have been having all of these meetings over the months, trying to shape these events and taking the lead in the different themes. The GlobalX Scientific Board has been very supportive, coming, participating and guiding our work, and if they will be also heavily involved in shaping the research agenda emerging from these discussions. And obviously the GlobalX Secretariats, both the previous one in Costa Rica, where Jeffrey and his team were part of when we started this workshop series, and the new Secretariat that has taken up since, KJ and his team, who are also hosting us in India. And we are very much looking forward to seeing all of you in India. Let me stop here. I'm not sure if I need to pass it on to anybody after this. Susan.
Sure. I will just say a word. Thank you very much, Erica, for that really outstanding capsulization of what's gone on in 5 very interesting workshops. And I would just extend again the invitation to everybody to continue this discussion about both the past and the future of GlobalX at the meeting in Kerala. in October. So thank you to all the speakers, including Erica, and see you again soon, everyone.